Hello friends, it's been about 6 months since I recorded one of these. It's the Wednesday the 17th of August 2022. A lot has happened in the interim, good things, but this will probably cover more of what's happened in the past 6 months. I'll get into some of the boat details maybe tomorrow or so. You can skip this if you want to focus more on just an overview of the boat or things. There's a couple things I'll bring up, but building boats is more than just building boats. Building boats often interacts with the rest of your life in one way or another, and that's also what leads people to building boats sometimes. So in the past 6 months I quit my job. I'm currently doing nothing. I was fortunate enough to be a senior electrical engineer with a tech company here in Seattle. Before that, I'd worked on underwater autonomous vehicles, but the company I was working for is very well intentioned, some very good people, but it wasn't the direction I want the world to go in. And more acutely, the situation there was they just couldn't retain top talent. Even opening up their checkbooks couldn't retain people, which really shows some bigger problems there. I wasn't the first to leave or the last, but definitely recognized that for my own health and sanity, it was time to move on. And so I've been very happy with that. I was fortunate that I was able to save enough that I could live a little lean and spend some time, several months after quitting, just doing other things. The first thing I did over the spring was I took sailing lessons, which might seem like an odd thing if you know me. I have over 1,000 hours, probably several thousand hours on, as a watch officer on an exploration ship. That would mean basically 8 hours a day. I was the officer in charge of the navigation watch on the bridge. The ship is mine, and on the types of ships I did that, it was me as the watch officer and a lookout usually, and that's all that's on the bridge. And at night the lookout does rounds, so sometimes it's me alone on the bridge. And so I have a lot of experience driving a large ship, or at least a reasonable amount of experience driving a large ship. That's not the same as sailing. Sailing is vastly different, and especially smaller craft. It's a different world. In college I built a Stevenson Weekender, tarp sails type of thing, and it was wonderful for what it was, and I kind of taught myself to get around, and it was sufficient. I was safe. I had a trolling motor, on that I could kick up, and I could get from A to B. It wasn't eloquent or especially skilled, and I'd read a little bit about sailing to do that, and was fortunate. I got a Islander Bahama 24 from a fascinating gentleman in Michigan, who he himself had built a boat years ago that made it into Sports Illustrated, even back when that would make it into Sports Illustrated. And he and an army buddy crossed the Atlantic. And so I was looking for a boat that would take me out on Lake Erie. And I called on someone else in Michigan on a boat that was online, and turns out it had sold. And weeks later, this gentleman had contacted me and said, "Hey, my friend said you were looking for a boat. Why don't you come up here and pick one out?" And he just had a whole bunch of boats, in his yard from a lifetime of sailing, and he was very generously offered, for a very reasonable price. I think it was $2,000 back in like 2006 or 7. He drove this Islander on a flatbed with a cradle down to Ohio, where I was living, and I used that for a summer on Lake Erie. But again, is learning informally to sail, and a couple times sailing it out there. It was also my first hint of no one wants to sail as much as the person who buys a sailboat. And so there's some experience there, but never formal. And so I just went to the local Center for Wooden Boats, which we're really lucky to have here. I'm a bit biased. It's on Lake Union, a freshwater lake here in Seattle, Washington. And they're kind of a living museum where not only can you, look at and learn more about, more traditional wooden boat building, but you can actually rent many of the boats in the collection. You know, and if you want to take a sailboat out, you have to get do a checkout qualification, or, you know, pass their class. The rowboats, anyone can take those out, and they also have free programs. And that was well worth it. One of the things that I learn in life is I love to read. I love to be prepared. You know, it's great for an engineer. But there's a point where there's diminishing returns on your reading unless you're actively practicing. And it makes sense. I mean, different people do learn in different ways, but, you know, there really needs to be a practical aspect to learning a skill. And so the class was really helpful for that. It was also helpful in reminding me that you don't need to be perfect in order to practice or, you know, go sailing or use these skills. I was used to, you know, my basic training was at the Merchant Marine Academy, not the normal 4-year program, but something special for my branch of the service. And, you know, it's reasonably rigorous, and you can go sailing without that level of rigor, and you can be perfectly safe. That's not an argument against knowing what you're doing. It's just a reminder that humans are allowed to do things, and perfection can be the enemy of the practical, which is a useful lesson for me, especially building this. So that was some time very well spent, learning to sail just on their boats. They're you know, around 20-some foot day sailers with a keel, a heavy metal keel underneath, really hard to you know, capsize, but wonderful vessels for that, and work in a decent range of wind conditions on the lake there. And so from that, I started volunteering at the Center for Wooden Boats, which was a great experience and continues to be. And I like this CWB, the Center for Wooden Boats, because they do a good job of making sure that, at least I feel, their boats are accessible to everyone. You know, I'm not currently working. I'm taking some wonderful time to do things like this. But at the same time, you know, every 3 hours you volunteer is 1 free hour of boat rental. They do have a program every Sunday night. They release slots for free rowboat rentals. So it's possible to, you know, take boats out without ever paying if you want to or need to. And there's a lot of volunteer opportunities, you know, outside of even just the 3 hours worked, 1 hour rentals. You know, there's you know, once a week a rowing opportunity where you can go before the open, take out rowboats, and get some time there that they don't charge for too if you're volunteering in general. So it's a really pretty good deal. And oh darn, I'm getting free rental time in exchange for learning how to do a lot of boat repair and, you know, just work around, you know, small sailboats. Pretty good deal. Other things, started some healthier things too. Started cycling a little bit recently. Like I now cycle downtown. It's about 12 miles. You might have seen some e-bikes in the background here. They're wonderful. It's about an hour to get downtown from where I live, which, depending on traffic, is about the same as driving some days, and you don't have to pay for parking. And about an hour back. I've also ridden up to the marina in Everett, which is about a little under 50 miles round trip, I think, where the McGregor, that bigger boat I have, is kept when it's not trailered at home during the winter. And that's been a pretty good deal, especially with the rowing. Get the lower body cycling down to the Center for Wooden Boats, go rowing or sailing, and then come back, cycle back up home is a pretty nice way to live. Trying to think what else has gone on. I feel like it comes up for sailors a lot more often, and it's a little more difficult to talk about. Changes in perspective on the world and everything. there's classical books that we kind of joke about that offer new and different perspectives on the world. Matissier is probably one of the most famous reading. Some of his works, abandoning the Golden Globe race and kind of going off to live a different life. And also a series of books that were very useful that I was introduced to by is actually someone on YouTube. There's the Ishmael series by, I believe it's Daniel Quinn. They're Ishmael, the story of B, and I think My Ishmael. And I used them as audiobooks. I listened to them while driving out to go backpacking different places or things like that. And it's hard to describe, but it's a useful different perspective on modern world and thinking about things from a perspective of a vision for things versus a program for things. Whereas a vision is something that drives a whole bunch of programs. A vision might be a cultural vision. We imagine that we're going to explore space. We imagine we're going to conquer the natural world or things like this. And then programs are things that support that, being the space program, or if it's a vision within our current culture of things like, oh, we need to save the environment. The program might be recycling or electric cars. But the book series also offers glimpses of thinking maybe beyond some of those things. It's difficult for me to explain. It's a lot to think about, but it's worth your time, especially as an audiobook, maybe to look into those. Getting back a bit more to the boat here, in the past 6 months, it's been slow but continual progress. I mentioned in an earlier video that when I cut the bulkheads out, I was aware that the easy, quick feeling progress was kind of over, and it became a lot of details. And so I've been working through some of those details here. And in the moment, I come to appreciate just how much work goes into a lot of things. But in between, it doesn't always feel like that. I think all of the bulkheads are now glued up with the cleats, the deck beams, major cutouts. One exception is one that I noticed in the plans. I think there's just a missing bit. And bulkhead number 1, we're looking at the after face of it here. Bulkhead number 1, I believe, should have cleats for lockers along these two sides, but I don't see it in the plans. When I look at other people's builds and the front side of bulkhead number 2, it sure looks like there's supposed to be lockers on the sides there. So I'll look at getting those put in there. There's a lot of work I have cleaning these up. I'm still getting a feel for epoxy, just especially as a glue, and trying to keep that nicer. Better respect for, I think it's is it Don Elliott's Building Paradox, the guide that I work through here. Spends a lot of time talking about ways you can clean up epoxy before it sets, and getting better appreciation for how advantageous that can be to do it at that stage. At the same time, belt sander, random orbital sander do pretty well. And after taking a metal boot camp, I have to admit I'm a little partial to like the 4.5-inch angle grinder with sanding discs on it. You have to be careful because it is very aggressive, but it's very fun. That can also make short work, especially if you're doing a lot of material removal and shaping. What I'm currently working on is the vent trunk and mast trunk that's on the afterface of bulkhead number 2. I can get into that more probably in a different video. It's interesting because I don't see a lot of people talking about how they did it. Even in the builder's guide, it's surprisingly sparse when discussing this, it seems. In other people's pictures, I see a lot of finished products. But it's an interesting 3D shape to make, just from flat lumber. I'm making some progress on that, but more as that goes along. The general approach I have is kind of laminating short segments of 2x4 and 1x4 to get a general bulk that I've epoxied together, and then cutting that down in kind of overlapping 2 dimensions with the other pieces for that to get an idea for the shape, and I'll illustrate that better as it comes together here. The other major thing that's happened is underneath the side panels here, I just built a cart out of 2x4s here, which uses 6 locking casters. I believe these are the 5-inch casters. Each will take 330 pounds if equally loaded. And so basically what I do is I use this to wheel all of my workspace out into the driveway here, so that I can create sawdust out there, not create a lot of sawdust in here. The drop claws that I used to try to keep the sawdust contained in here didn't work overly well. They did a little bit of, they helped a little bit, but it wasn't a great solution. So generating the sawdust, at least in the summer and fall, out in the driveway won't be a lot better, and has been so far. Most of the time I just wheel everything out and work there. Gurneys continue to be very helpful. I'll probably post a link. I took a break from building the Paradox for 2 weeks. I was getting a little discouraged at just how slow things were going here. I remembered building the Stevenson Weekender, and that took me 6 months from start to finish, evenings and weekends to make. And the Paradox just was taking me a lot longer. And I saw something in the magazine Small Craft Advisor, these tiny little racing sailboats, little Sharpies, that just mentioned we'll have an article in the next issue talking about the Ponzi racing craze. And they looked really cool, so I looked them up. And I think it's a group in Antigua who basically just, I think one of them built a small Sharpie sailboat, possibly for a swimming pool originally, and they eventually created a bunch of racers out of them. They're like a 2-sheet plywood sailboat, and as far as I can tell, the class rules are basically measure the pink one, which later they put out a small PDF, and so they give you the dimensions for the base hull, and 2, when racing, your butt must remain on the bottom of the boat. And they're pretty small, and when you race one of them, you can definitely feel you are an integral part of keeping it upright. But when it comes to the rig, the design within the hull, whatever lifting bodies you have underneath, that's all up to the designer. If you want a full keel, if you want a centerboard, if you want a dagger board, that's all up to the designer. So recognizing that this will not be ready in time for the bulk of the sailing season this summer, I kind of said screw it, and I went to the hardware store, bought my 2 sheets of plywood and other fittings, and in 2 weeks put together a little 7.5 foot, so between 2 and 3 meters, little racing Sharpie. I don't race it, I just dink around on a local lake so far, but it was really fun. And it also reminded me that the epoxy building style here does take longer, at least for me, to put together than the tight bond and screw method, and then just covering it in a fiberglass and epoxy method that I used on the Stevenson Weekender. This does take me more time just to get things done, and that's okay. And it seems like this might be stronger and a bit more long-lasting. But building that boat also reminded me that I should probably err a bit more personally on the side of building something that is not quite work boat, but I'm not building a work of art. For me, the important thing is getting out on the water. And so when it comes to making those decisions, erring a bit more on practical, do it now and get out there type of thing. I vaguely recall, and I could get this wrong, but when I was building the Stevenson Weekender, there was someone who was like carving intricate rope work into some of the trim on their Weekender, and I built my entire boat in the time it took them, just while working on some of these finishing details. And that's perfectly all right. But at the same time, I remember if I'd personally tried to do that, it would not have been the project that I needed or the boat I needed at the time or wanted at the time. And so as I see a lot of people who've done very beautifully finished paradoxes, I remember that my intention is more to get out on the water with something that is, structurally sound, but frankly, I intend to beat the crap out of on beaches and, doing interesting things with, responsibly, but it's not going to be a museum piece is the goal. So trying to keep that in mind as I build. There were some good lessons from that little Sharpie Ponzi project that I made there. The nice thing about the Ponzi project that's also informative for the Paradox is it really does make a difference when, the Ponzi is small enough I can throw it in the back of my pickup truck. You probably throw it in the back of a hatchback car with some flagging on the back. And even the mast and the sails I just made out of poly tarps again for that one. It's truly a boat that I can completely handle on my own. I can park away from the launch site. I can lug it over my shoulder and, just assemble beside a dock or something and go out sailing in, like half an hour setup, worst case, half an hour tear down, worst case, and, just be out there pretty easy. And when I have a sailboat that I can launch and handle myself, I'm out there very frequently, which is a nice thing. So both with that, and I eventually caved and I bought the weekday pass at the Center for Wooden Boats. So on the weekdays that center is open, I can go up there and rent their boats as much as I want. So I've been using it as an excuse to take friends out on their lunch breaks, or also just learn some of the other boats there. I've been exploring Pelicans, which are a small kind of a blunt-fronted sailboat that they have. And they're pretty neat. Pound a little bit more in some weather, but I went up to the Port Townsend Pocket Yachtapalooza back a month ago, and there are a couple Pelicans there, and there was a third one for sale up there. They seem popular out here. I think they might be from San Francisco originally. I'm not sure that's a project in my future, but it's probably a project that's on the scale of or a little maybe simpler than a Paradox. That's an interesting, like day sailor to look into, or I guess people might call it a raid camper or something like that. But it's a fun boat to learn to sail. And then this Saturday, I'm actually going to the center as a workshop for learning to sail more traditional rigged and centerboard boats for people who've completed their classes. So I've got some experience on the Pelicans before taking that class. So it should be interesting. And I really like it there because you have people with a lot of experience with these things who can teach you things that you're not going to read or learn without experiencing them. And it's sometimes helpful to have some of those things pointed out too. So it's been a summer full of cycling, backpacking, not related to boats necessarily, but someday hopefully related to boats, and plenty of sailing. So while the Paradox might not have moved forward as much as I'd originally imagined, definitely feel like I've been able to put a lot of time in for learning. And so I'll talk a little bit more next time, I think, about that the vent trunk on the after side of Bulkhead number 2, and if I'm successful in the current attempt at getting the block of wood that goes at the bottom of that sorted out. And then I'll also cover a bit more the stem piece, which I was able to put together, and some of the work I did there. But those are topics for another time. So just a quick update. That's all for now. Take care.